often talk about the narrative gap in the media. Where is the Western press getting the Gaza story wrong?
Well, gosh. Okay, let's look at the role of the media. So militarily, Hamas are, of course, much weaker than Israel and always have been. The Israeli army is much, much stronger than Hamas. So Hamas had to use whatever weapons it could. And one weapon is public opinion and the media. In other words, Hamas maybe can't beat Israel militarily. They can damage Israel, they can fire rockets, they can kill people in Israel, and they do, and they've done suicide bombings, but they can't, they're not in a position to actually destroy Israel or something. So what Hamas has done is utilize media and other public opinion to try and pressure Israel that way. And during this war, they were constantly trying to pressure Israel into ceasefires before Israel was ready, either by releasing cynical hostage videos or videos that looked like people on the verge of death when they weren't necessarily. The hostages were not necessarily. They deliberately made them look worse to try and manipulate Israeli opinion. Also, I'm not for one moment suggesting that thousands of civilians have died in this war. Palestinian civilians, also some Israeli ones, and of course that's been horrendous. However, Hamas have had a de facto interest to try to exaggerate the number of civilian deaths because it plays into their hands. If they can say Israel's hit a hospital, 500 dead, they can then put pressure as they did. And I'm talking about a particular occasion when Israel had not hit a hospital. In fact, Islamic Jihad, another Palestinian group, had tried to fire a rocket at Israel and by mistake hit the hospital car park. And Hamas immediately, and maybe a few people were killed, Hamas immediately put out a statement saying exactly 487 people or whatever had died, as if anyone could possibly count within 20 minutes in the middle of the night how many people had died. And it puts it out to friendly news agencies, not just in Iran or Qatar or Al Jazeera, but also in the West. And those friendly journalists in the West who are eager to say Israel's terrible and Israel's committing genocide and Israel's a terrible country that we in the West shouldn't be, supporting, immediately put it out. And Hamas knows this because if Israel will be under pressure to stop a military action in the middle, if that action is being seen to being much more violent or vicious than it in fact is. So there is a gap between the number of civilians dying and the numbers not. There's also been a gap between, there's been starvation or famine declared at various points in the last year. What Hamas have done is they've invited friendly photographers from international agencies, and they've done photo shoots with poor little children who suffer from things like cerebral palsy and other genetic disorders. And then they have cropped the photos to remove the brothers and sisters of the child who are not starving. And then they've said these kids are starving to death when in fact they weren't starving to death. And Hamas's own hospital records from a year or two earlier when these children were born showed that these children were born with terrible genetic conditions, which I have to say every country has, unfortunately. There's such children like that in Israel and in America and everywhere else. So there's a lot of manipulation of the media, but that's not to say there isn't a lot of genuine suffering and deaths and people living in tents and not enough supplies and so on. There is, for sure. But at the same time, there's also a lot of propaganda. And it's not easy for journalists to report from any war zone, including from Gaza. Nevertheless, this war has shown that a lot of journalists have a lot of their own viewpoints and prejudices, and they have not necessarily been objective journalists. They've taken sides in a way that, journalists are not meant to. And it's not just in Gaza. I'll just make one other small point that I heard the other day. In America, in the past, When some famous news presenter retired, he went into retirement. No one knew his opinions. Today, you have big news presenters like Tucker Carlson, left Fox News, and the other day Don Lemon was arrested, left CNN. These were two of the biggest names on Fox and CNN. And we, the public, know every one of their opinions about everything, okay? So we're living in an age where journalists, instead of being the news reporters or the new anchors, decided to participate from one side or the other with viewpoints. And that puts into question their reliability because they have agendas. So I don't want to say it's only people in Gaza. It's actually a global problem where journalists, and that's one reason a lot of people all over the world, also in the democracies, don't trust the mainstream media anymore.